From Studio 19, I'm Jeff Allen Wolf, and this is definitely a world gone mad. Like I've said in past episodes, there's so many news stories to share with you and comment on that sometimes there's not enough time to get them all into one episode. And sometimes the day's news events are the same garbage from the day before. And even though there are a lot of stories that happened in the past 48 hours, I felt I didn't want to repeat the same stress and garbage. Instead, I wanted to address something very important to you, the Wolfpack. Are we so fractured as a democracy that we may never recover? That's not a rhetorical question. I'm asking because I honestly don't know the answer anymore. Now, for most of my life, I assumed America would eventually find its footing again after any massive problems. We'd fight through ugly elections, argue over taxes, foreign policy decisions, social issues, the size of government, you name it. Tempers would flare, politicians would say outrageous things, pundits would predict the end of the republic for the 437th time. And eventually, the country would keep moving. Lately, though, I found myself wondering whether this moment is different, or whether every generation eventually asks itself the same question. Political disagreement isn't new. If you go back to the earliest days of the country, the arguments could be vicious. Leaders questioned each other's motives. Newspapers printed outrageous accusations. And political rivals treated each other more like enemies than colleagues. Now look, I don't believe Donald Trump created every division in this country. Those cracks were already there. But Trump and the MAGA movement found those cracks, widened them, magnified them, and turned political division into something far more personal and hostile than anything I've witnessed in my lifetime. It isn't just what happens in Washington anymore. Politics follows us into family dinners, workplaces, social media feeds, neighborhood gatherings, and for some families, right to the Thanksgiving Day table. Nothing says Happy Thanksgiving quite like passing the mashed potatoes while your uncle accuses your cousin of personally destroying democracy. Now, that's festive. So disagreement isn't the story. The question is whether something about today's disagreements feels different. Somewhere along the way, politics stopped being a disagreement over the best route to the same destination. Now it feels like half the country thinks we're driving to New York, while the other half insists we're headed to the moon. And both sides are convinced the GPS is part of a conspiracy. Observers have pointed to growing disagreements within both Republicans and Democrats about priorities, strategy, and the future direction of their parties. It can leave many people wondering who's steering the ship while everyone debates where it ought to go. Now imagine hiring a crew to repair your roof only to discover half the team is debating which ladder to use while the other half is arguing whether the roof needed fixing in the first place. Eventually you stop caring who's winning the argument. You just want somebody to fix the damn roof before it starts raining in your living room. Maybe that's what keeps sticking with me. It's whether we still believe disagreement could eventually lead somewhere constructive. Have we reached a point where every election simply creates the conditions for the next war instead of resolving anything? The country has endured civil conflict, economic crisis, social upheaval, and mistrust before. Institutions have been tested repeatedly, and many eventually adapted, though often more slowly than anyone wanted. History can provide perspective. It doesn't provide guarantees. What does recovery actually look like? Does it mean everybody suddenly agrees? Of course not. That's never happened. Does it mean elections become less heated? Probably not. Democracy has always been noisy. Maybe recovery looks less dramatic than we imagine. Maybe it looks like disagreeing without assuming the other person must be acting in bad faith. Maybe it looks like being willing to revise an opinion when new evidence comes along. Maybe it looks like expecting our own preferred leaders to meet the same standards we expect of everyone else. Those sound almost ordinary, which may be why they can feel surprisingly difficult. Major social changes, technology, media, economic pressures, demographic shifts, and the personalities of political leaders have all shaped this moment in different ways. Reasonable people can disagree about the proportions, even if they recognize that polarization has become more visible and more personal. That's why I hesitate to predict the future. I don't know whether recovery takes one election, like the midterms, one decade, one generation, or whether future historians will look back and say, this was simply another painful chapter that eventually gave way to something healthier. I'm not convinced I'll see that recovery in my lifetime. The damage to democracy didn't happen overnight, and it won't disappear because one election ends or one political figure eventually leaves the stage. It may take decades and possibly several generations to rebuild the trust, the shared reality, and the democratic habits we've allowed to erode. What I do know is that democracies depend on more than constitutions and elections. They also depend on habits, listening, arguing, compromising, accepting losses, accepting victories, trusting that today's opponent is still part of tomorrow's country. Those habits are harder to measure than approval ratings. They're also probably more important. So I keep coming back to the same question that I started this episode with. Are we witnessing one more difficult season in a long democratic story? Or are we living through something that future generations will recognize as a genuine turning point? I don't pretend to know the answer, Wolfpack, but I do think it's a question worth asking, because sometimes the most important conversations aren't the ones where everyone leaves agreeing. They're the ones where everyone leaves thinking. History has a way of revealing the answers long after the people living through it are gone. The only question is whether our grandchildren will read about this era or spend the rest of their lives living with what it became. But for now, Wolfpack, one thing seems impossible to ignore. Whatever history eventually decides about this moment, we're the generation living it. The choices we make, the voices we raise, and the things we're willing to accept will determine what comes next. And until the evidence says otherwise, I'd have to call it exactly what I've been calling it all along: a world gone mad. If you've enjoyed the podcast, learned something, or even shared a laugh along the way, please consider helping keeping it going. If you'd like to support the show, you'll find the link in the episode description. Every contribution truly makes a difference. And please share this podcast with others. Let them know the podcast exists. I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. I'll be back Wednesday. Until then, I urge you, the Wolfpack, remain skeptical, question everything. Please don't lose hope. And most of all, stay alert.